Welcome to this third video in the series of the English defense. And we're going to look at probably the most critical setup that White can play in this short video we're doing. And this video will hopefully cover you totally for White's move Bishop d3, which we'll come on to next. And after this video and the following two videos, you will have a great repertoire to play against one d4. Well, that's the idea anyway. So let's see. Okay, so we're looking at this obviously from the black point of view, and after the move d4, our move order is to start with e6. And if you can remember the rule from the previous two videos, my basic rule was you only play the move b6 when White goes c4. So when White plays c4, you play b6 to get into the English defense. Now, I also noted in those videos, in the move order we're using here, you do have to be prepared to enter a French defense with if White plays e4 here, which I have to say, if White goes 1 d4, it's quite rare they're going to want to all of a sudden then play a king's pawn opening. It's much more likely that they'll do another move here. And we will look at alternatives to c4 in the fifth video in this series. So ways that you might be tricked out somewhat. And I'll give you some recommendations then. But we're now going to look at the most critical variation. And that is with c4 and the rule. White plays c4. So we now go b6. This hyper-modern English defense where we attack the center from the side. So remember, plan one, get our bishop to b7 and attack the center from the side with that bishop. Plan two normally is bishop to b4 check or bishop to b4 pinning the knight on c3. And then often in the English defense, the main move we rely on is plan three, the crowbar f5. So remember these ideas, and these ideas work especially well when your opponent tries to take over the center with the move e4, and this is what we're going to look at now. And really these videos are mainly aimed against this setup where White gains a strong center. Other setups not so critical. Now, okay, so we play plan one here. We attack the center from the side, bishop to b7. And here in this video, we're concentrating on bishop to d3. Now, this move, theoretically speaking, is considered to be White's best option at this moment in time. Now, why is this superior maybe to the other options we've looked at, knight to c3 and f3? Well, the thing is, after bishop to d3, if Black plays bishop to b4 check, which is actually my main recommendation, White does not have to respond with knight to c3. So in these variations, White doesn't have to allow the white knight to be pinned on c3. There are other ways to block the bishop to b4 check, mainly by bishop to d2. So that is the first reason why this bishop move is quite a nice move. The other reason is, well, the natural move here would be the crowbar move f5, but I suggest you do not play this move in this position. I don't think it's the correct way to play. Stick with plan two, which was bishop to b4 check, which we'll come on to shortly. Just to mention why I don't think f5 is a good move. It now gives White the option of playing e takes f5, and this is an extremely dangerous move to face. Now, it may look like, oh, you can win the pawn on g2, happy days. But the problem is, if you go grabbing this pawn on g2 with bishop takes g2, your king will be under extreme fire with the move queen to h5 check. Look at this poor little guy on e8. He's under pressure already. And unlike some of the other variations, the black king can no longer go to f8. And this is a very risky position. Theoretically, I wouldn't recommend you play this from black. Even if you win a rook, it doesn't matter if you get checkmated. So that is the problem with this line. And the other thing worth mentioning is if you try bishop to b4 check here, well, this used to be a very playable move, because now White has to be very careful. Because if White played a funny move like knight to c3, well, this is now clearly a blunder. because now you can take on g2. And the difference after queen to h5 check is that your king has the f8 square, so king to f8, and you will win the rook on h1, and your king is not under so much danger here. But the problem is, after bishop to b4 check, it was then found that white can play the rather strange looking move king to f1. But this move works very well here because the king defends the pawn on g2 and white has won a pawn on f5. So this is why the crowbar move after bishop to d3, the crowbar f5 move, does not work. My recommendation here is to play bishop to b4 check. And this also fits in quite well with our plan of going bishop to b7 first, bishop to b4 next, and then sometimes f5. But we don't always play the crowbar in this particular variation. Now, the move knight to c3 here would lead back into the previous video, because then we can play the crowbar f5, so we don't need to concern ourselves about that move. King to f1 is actually a move which is not so crazy after bishop to b4 check. So bishop to b4 check here, and now the move king to f1 is not ridiculous here. Both sides have gained something. Black has forced the white king to move, but now white is also trying to prove that bishop on b4 is not so well placed, and it could be exposed and white has a space advantage. Now, the way I play against this, and I have played, is a ridiculous looking move, but in actual sense, it makes some logical sense. I've always played the ridiculous looking move, bishop back to f8. Now, you may be thinking, he's gone crazy. He's cracked. He's eventually cracked. The Ginger GM has eventually cracked and he's lost his mind. Now, don't worry, it's not the first time someone said that, but this kind of makes some sense. What I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to get into what we call a hippopotamus setup. And the setup I'm going for is called the hippopotamus because it's supposed to look like a hippopotamus. Now, not seeing too many hippopotamuses in the streets of London, I'm not so sure if it's actually looks like a hippopotamus. That could be a song. Not seeing a hippopotamus in the streets of London. That sounds like a great lyrics to a song. But anyway, I digress. But the hippopotamus is basically where we go g6, bishop g7, d6, knight d7, knight e7. And I had one game in this line which continued as such. Knight to c3, g6. So I went for my hippopotamus setup. White develops as well. And now I got my hippopotamus moves in. I kicked this bishop away. I went d6. And the good thing about this, compared to a normal hippopotamus, is that white's king is on f1, and it probably does not want to be on f1. And here I continued with sensible moves, and I quickly got a very good game. So you can go for this hippopotamus setup if you want to be a bit weird and wacky with bishop to f8. There is another option if you didn't quite like the look of that, and the other option here is the move e5, going for a pawn sacrifice line. And the reason we're sacrificing a pawn is because our opponent's king is misplaced. We can maybe afford to do this. And there was one Grandmaster game which continued pawn takes pawn, and now d6. And I think at club level, international master level, even IM level, this would be a very effective way to play. The point being, after something like a3, bishop c5, pawn takes d6, maybe bishop takes d6 here, knight c3, knight c6. Black is only a pawn down, but black can try to castle queenside quickly. You have a knight coming to e5, and white's king will never be able to castle. So this seems like great initiative to me. So that's the more aggressive way of playing. Anyway, back to bishop b4 check. I think I'll be very surprised if your opponent plays king to f1 here. It's really quite a highly fought after move, and it's kind of one that you'd only see at top level. A much more natural way to play is bishop to d2. And this is one of the reasons white plays the bishop to d3. Now, we haven't got the pin on the knight on c3, but our plan now will continue with bishop takes d2. Black is slightly more cramped, and when you're slightly more cramped in chess, a rule you should remember is the exchanges of pieces help you out, because it means your pieces that remain won't become congested. They won't get in the way of each other as much. And after this bishop takes d2 move, white has two options, two sensible options. Queen takes d2 or knight takes d2. Now, we'll have a look at these one by one. I would consider the move knight takes d2 to be the main move because this reinforces the pawn on e4. Now, if white plays queen takes d2, we can now come back to our crowbar move because at the moment, the pawn on e4 is not particularly well guarded. I wouldn't recommend you play this against knight takes d2, but only against queen takes d2 because white hasn't moved a piece into the game to defend e4. So what is the crowbar move? If you've been watching these videos, you should really know this move by now. f5. And here, again, white's e4 pawn is under pressure. White can't move that pawn because we take on g2. And if white tries to guard the center with knight to c3, we increase the pressure against e4. How do we do this? Knight to f6. And here, well, there was one game that continued queen to e2, trying to guard the points on e4. If f3, I would recommend you continue in similar to fashion to what we looked at in a previous video, where as soon as our opponent plays f3, we finish our development and we actually aim to target the other central pawn. And if you watch the previous videos in this series, you will see that normally the correct move here is knight to c6. And this leads to positions we should be accustomed to. Now, very interesting game. Did continue queen to e2 here. Black simply castled, knight to f3, and now black took on e4 and went knight to c6. And after a3, knight to a5. This is a very clever move because now one of the threats is to take on e4 twice when c4 won't be defended. And after rook to c1, defending c4, black attacked quickly with knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and now the tactical blow, bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, knight takes c4. And I'll let you work this out at home if you want to, but the idea is to go d5, next move, and even though white can take with check on e6, there's a rook to e8 coming. So if you want to pause the video at any point during this, just pause it to look at the position a little bit deeper because I do tend to go through these videos quite quickly and to cram in as much information as I can. So that is my recommended move after the sequence. If we just go back, bishop to d3, bishop to b4 check, bishop d2, the most logical move. We swap off on d2. And now if white doesn't reinforce the e4 square with knight takes d2, but plays queen takes d2, we can crowbar with f5. Now, if white plays knight takes d2, our game plan slightly changes here because it wouldn't make as much sense now to attack the e4 pawn because when we go to attack it with a move like f5, we're not actually threatening to take on e4. And a little rule to remember in English defenses, whenever you play the crowbar move f5, you really should be creating the threat of winning the pawn on e4. So the crowbar move e4 works a lot better when you're considering and threatening to take on e4 winning a pawn. And that doesn't work in this position. Now here, what we should do now, because white's knight on d2 is not ideally placed, it'd much rather be on the c3 square. The way I enjoy playing this position is by now attacking the d4 pawn. And I've always played knight to c6 here, which I think is a very nice idea. Now, the idea behind this, so we are bringing another strategy into play we haven't seen yet. The idea is to attack d4. Now, if white ever pushes forwards with the move d5, we try to control all of these kind of weakened dark squares that I've just highlighted in the center of the board. So we plonk our knight into e5, a lovely square for the knight, and when the bishop moves, we want to maybe control the f4 square, so we can even play a move like g5 here. And this is actually positionally very well founded. We want to keep the e5 square as an outpost for our knight and stop the move f4. And here we want to go something like queen f6, making our control over the dark squares even greater And then we can even castle queenside. So let's just have a look at some examples of these ideas in action. So when your opponent takes on d2 with a knight, we go for dark square control in the center and pressure against d4. Now, white generally defends this pawn and develops his knight. Now, there was one game where two grandmasters playing, the very strong player Eduardo from France, 2650, played this position with black. And after knight to e2, he continued with his attack of the d4 square. And he played the move queen to f6, a very common idea in this variation. Now, again, if white pushes the d pawn, our knight comes into e5, great control of the dark squares. And if white ever plays e5 in these positions, which he often does, this helps us in a couple of ways. Well, we have to lose the tempo by moving our queen, but now our remaining bishop, the bishop on b7, has a great range. It's not blocked in anymore by pawn on e4. And another move we have to remember to play after this e5 move, which we'll see very shortly, is at some point we have to play f6 and try to take on e5, blowing up the center, exploding the center of the board. And our king generally goes queenside. So e5 can be played. In the game in question, white played knight to f3, trying to keep his pawns flexible. And now a very nice move, g5, going for control of the dark squares. e5 was played. The queen came back to g7. White castled, and now g4. Knight to d2. And here, a little test for you guys at home. Let's see if you're actually listening to the tips I'm giving you here. What is one of the main moves you should be playing in this position once white has advanced with e5? What is a great way to explode those pawns in the center? f6. And black got a fantastic position after pawn takes f6, knight takes f6, with castling queenside later, and then dirty Harry the h-pawn can roll up the board. So a very promising game there. So let's just have a look at this one more time with knight takes d2. Knight to c6 is now the correct move because you want to attack the dark squares when white sufficiently defends the e4 point. And what about now knight to f3? So we haven't actually looked at this way that white can defend so far. Well, yet again, nearly always the move you rely on in these positions, you have to pressurize the dark squares, queen to f6. Now, if white plays d5 here, our knight always comes into the e5 square, trying to take control of those dark squares. And now something like knight takes e5, queen takes e5, queen c2, because the b2 pawn was on pre. And here, I like the move knight to e7. Why? Because I want to control the f4 square. I want to play either g5 and knight g6, really gaining positional control over the f4 square. And this position is fine for black. So the way that white has mainly played here is to advance with e5. And now I've had this maybe 4 or 5 times, and I've had a great score in this position. And now I always play the move here, queen to f4. Now I play this move because, again, I'm pressurizing the d4 pawn. And this is one of the strange openings, the English defense, where it actually helps you a number of times to maneuver your queen often around the board because your queen creates a lot of weaknesses. And we're going to see this in the next video. We're going to see some crazy queen maneuvers in the next video. And the idea here, I want to try to make white play g3, which he should play. And now my queen comes back to h6. And why have I made white play the move g3? Think logically. Well, again, it's to do with my bishop on b7. I've made white go e4, weakening the diagonal a little bit. And I've made him go g3, weaken it even more. And the threat in this position here is the immediate knight takes d4. That is the threat. So after white castles, what is that move, that explosion in the center of the board we need to play? f6. And I had a game recently in the Isle of Man Congress, the PokerStars Isle of Man Congress in 2014, which continued rook to e1 here. Of course, I castle queenside, a3, and now It's clear I've castled on the queen side, my opponent's castled on the king side, so it's time to attack. How do we generally attack when both sides castle on opposite sides of the board? We do the pawn storm, la pawn storm, g5, just as Edouard played. And the threat here again is to go g4 and take the pawn on d4. My opponent tried to counterattack in the center, but now I cleared up the center of the board. I took on e5. My opponent took on e5. I need to develop my one remaining piece, knight to f6. Knight to e4 was played. I simply took on e4, and now I have a half open file on the f file. My rook came to that half open file. And one last question for you guys. My opponent now blundered with rook to e5. Black to play and get a winning advantage in this position. And you know what? I will leave you with that question whilst we go over the main points of this particular variation. So black to play here and get a winning advantage. I'm not even going to tell you the answer. Pause the video if you haven't got it. And now we'll look at the main points of this bishop to d3 move again. So the English defense, we are really at the moment only considering what happens when white gets his three pawns in the center. And you know what? You won't get this all the time. I should point out in the English defense, white will try other setups against you. We'll have a look at these in the last video. And here, bishop to b7, bishop to d3, stage 2, you check on b4. After bishop d2, you capture on d4. If knight takes, e4 is very well defended. So what pawn do you target? The d4 pawn with ideas knight c6, queen f6, and even g5. If white takes with the queen, well now, the rule I said earlier, if you can use the crowbar f5 and it makes a threat of taking on e4, winning a pawn, it's often the correct way to play. So all in all, that's really everything you need to know for this critical bishop to d3 line to give you a chance of using this very exciting English defense opening. And we now only have 2 more videos left in this series, and they're hopefully going to be a lot of fun and get you fully equipped to play the English defense.